6 seconds. That is the number now circulating out of Chinese battery labs, and here is the part almost nobody explains correctly. It is real, and it is not the whole story. Let me tell you what that actually means in plain English. 6 seconds refers to a small format laboratory cell pushed to an extreme charging rate filled to a partial state of charge, not a battery pack you could put in a car today. You heard that right. The full verified picture is a lithium-ion cell reaching 68% capacity in 45 seconds, under conditions 80 times faster than a normal charge, published and peer-reviewed. And that is just the beginning, because the material behind both numbers is the same discovery, and the mechanism that makes it possible is stranger than either headline lets on. If atomic scale engineering is your thing, hit a quick like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly which number to trust and why the real one is still enough to terrify the battery industry. In 2018, a team working across Cambridge and Argonne National Laboratory published a discovery that changed how the battery world thought about speed. Led by materials scientist Claire Gray, the group identified a class of crystal structures called niobium tungsten oxides, capable of moving lithium ions through a solid particle faster than almost anything tested before. It was, by any honest measure, a milestone. For the first time, a battery material could be charged in minutes instead of hours, without shrinking the particles down to fragile, unstable nanoscale grains. Engineers had spent decades fighting the same physical wall. Lithium ions moved through a crystal lattice the way people move through a single revolving door. Add more people, and the door does not spin faster. It jams. The conventional fix was to grind the particles down to nano size, opening more doors at once, but that came at a cost. Smaller particles meant less density, higher production expense, and batteries that degraded faster under real-world stress. Niobium tungsten oxide broke that trade-off. It moved lithium at rates several orders of magnitude faster than standard electrode materials, even at particle sizes measured in micrometers rather than nanometers. It was in every sense the correct precedent. A genuine leap forward, and one the entire battery research community immediately recognized as such. But here is what most people never think about when they hear breakthrough material. A discovery is not the same thing as a solved problem. 7 years after niobium tungsten oxide entered the literature, one number still had not moved. Sub 1 minute charging. Full, usable charging, not a partial trickle in a lab format coin cell, remained locked out of reach. The reason had nothing to do with the material's chemistry and everything to do with what nobody could see. Researchers understood that lithium ions were bottlenecking somewhere inside these crystals. They just did not know where or why. Push the charging rate high enough, and even niobium tungsten oxide started refusing ions at the door, unless you were only asking for a small slice of the full charge. For an industry chasing gasoline speed refueling, that unexplained wall was the entire ballgame. That is the wall this story begins at. Not a wall of ambition, a wall of ignorance, a gap in understanding so specific that it kept an already proven material from reaching its own honest ceiling, and left just enough confusion in the air for headline numbers like 6 seconds to spread without context. And what happened next did not just chip away at that wall. It went inside the crystal itself, at a resolution nobody had managed before, and found the exact mechanism the entire field had been missing. In 2019, engineering teams began trying to turn niobium tungsten oxide from a laboratory curiosity into something a factory could actually build. The goal was blunt: take a material proven to move lithium ions faster than almost anything on record and scale it into a real battery pack. The reaction from much of the industry was cool skepticism. Niobium is not cheap, and it is not evenly distributed. The majority of the world's supply comes out of Brazil, according to United States Geological Survey data, which made procurement teams nervous before a single cell had even been tested at scale. Battery chemists at several established manufacturers openly questioned whether a material this exotic could ever compete on cost with the electrode chemistries already sitting on production lines. They said the same thing about lithium iron phosphate. Here is where the consensus broke the first time, and almost nobody noticed. When LFP chemistry was proposed back in the 1990s, mainstream battery researchers dismissed it outright. Too low voltage, too low conductivity. A theoretical curiosity with no path to a factory floor. It took years of quiet, unglamorous engineering to prove them wrong. And today, that same impractical chemistry sits inside a majority of the electric vehicles rolling off assembly lines in the world's largest EV market. Dismissal in battery science has a bad track record. The early NBWO commercialization attempts did not fail because the material was fake or the physics was wrong. They failed because nobody understood why the material behaved the way it did once you pushed it past a certain speed. Charge it slowly, and it performed beautifully. Push it toward the extreme rates that produced those eye-catching lab cell numbers, and full usable capacity dropped off a cliff nobody could explain. Teams could reproduce the effect. They could not explain it, and they could not scale it past a small format research cell. This is where the mainstream coverage stopped. The story, as most people encountered it, ended there. A promising material, a confusing set of lab-only numbers, and a limitation nobody could name. But a small team combining electron microscopy with machine learning was not ready to accept that the mystery was permanent. They were not trying to chase a headline number yet. They were trying to see something nobody had ever actually watched happen. Lithium ions, one at a time, moving through a crystal at the exact moment everything went wrong. What they found did not just explain the failure, it explained why the failure was never really about the material at all. Picture a parking garage with narrow, precisely painted lines. At normal speed, every car glides into its slot, and the whole structure operates like clockwork. Now imagine cars entering at 80 times normal speed, all at once. If everyone still tries to align perfectly with the lines, you get gridlock. Bent bumpers, blocked lanes, a structure straining against its own order. But if the cars stop caring about the lines entirely and just wedge in wherever there is space, the garage somehow empties and fills faster than it ever did with everyone following the rules. That, almost impossibly, is what happens inside niobium tungsten oxide crystals under extreme charging rates. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Researchers expected that pushing lithium ions through the crystal faster would distort the internal lattice more severely, the same way forcing more cars into a garage faster should produce more chaos, not less. Using in situ electron microscopy, the team watched lithium ions arrange themselves in tight, orderly rows during slow charging. And that orderliness was the problem. Precise alignment locks the lattice into a rigid, strained configuration, and strain is what throttles ion movement. At extreme charging rates, something counterintuitive took over. The ions distributed themselves randomly through the material instead of locking into neat rows, and that randomness relieved the very lattice distortion that had been slowing everything down. Material scientists call this a rate-dependent lattice relaxation process tied to a phenomenon called the John Teller effect. In plain English, at extreme speed, the crystal stops fighting itself. The measurement backing this up came directly from the electron microscope data. A clear, repeatable pattern showing lattice strain decreasing, not increasing, as charging speed rose past a critical threshold. Disorder was the advantage the whole industry had been engineering against. That single discovery explained why NBWO cells got faster and more stable at extreme rates instead of falling apart, and why researchers kept pushing the charge rate even higher in small test cells, chasing exactly the kind of number that later got flattened into a headline. Here's what most people get wrong about fast charging. They assume speed is always the enemy of structure. In this material, at this rate, speed was structure's cure. But understanding why the crystal stopped fighting itself only solved half the mystery. The lattice was no longer the bottleneck. Something else, somewhere else in the crystal, still was, and it was blocking almost every lithium ion trying to get in the door. Here's the brutal catch the first discovery created. Relaxing the lattice solved the internal distortion problem, but it did nothing about how lithium ions actually entered the crystal in the first place. Electron microscopy revealed something the team had not expected. Lithium ions only wanted to enter through one specific crystal face, a direction researchers label the E10 surface. Every other surface on the crystal, and there were far more of those, actively resisted entry. Picture a stadium with a single working turnstile and a dozen locked gates, all facing a crowd that has nowhere else to go. That is what was happening at extreme charging speeds. Ions piled up against the wrong faces of the crystal, found no way in, and the charging rate collapsed no matter how relaxed the internal lattice had become. The obvious fix? Shrink the particles so more of that one working face was exposed. Was the same nanoscaling trick the field had been trying to avoid for a decade since it wrecked cost density, and durability all at once. So the team asked a different question. What if, instead of shrinking the crystal, you simply redirected the ions that were hitting the wrong doors? It sounds like it should not work. Coating a fast-charging material with an additional layer sounds like adding friction, not removing it, but the team applied a thin layer of reduced graphene oxide, engineered through a machine learning-assisted interface strategy, specifically designed to intercept lithium ions arriving at the wrong surfaces and physically funnel them toward the Euro-10 openings where entry was easy. That is exactly why it does work. The coating was not a barrier. It was a traffic controller. The measured result from the modified material designated RGO-NB165055 reached 116 millimours per gram, 68.5% of its full theoretical capacity, in 45 seconds, at a charging rate of 80 times normal. Push a smaller format version of that same cell to even more extreme rates, sampling only a partial state of charge, and you land in the single-digit second range that keeps circulating online. Same mechanism. Same material family. A very different claim. Two separate discoveries, each explaining half of a problem nobody had fully understood for 7 years, had just been solved within the same research program. But a result inside a single crystal, measured against a lithium metal counter electrode in a lab, is not the same thing as a battery anyone can build a car around. Turning a mechanism into a machine was about to become an entirely different kind of problem. Here is where the story really begins for anyone who actually builds batteries for a living. A crystal behaving well under a microscope is a scientific result. A crystal behaving well across billions of particles, packed into an electrode, wired into a working cell, is an engineering problem of an entirely different scale. The old approach to fast-charging materials treated every improvement as a standalone fix. Better particle size here, a coating there, bolted onto electrode designs that were never built with directional transport in mind. That approach kept hitting the same wall the wider industry had hit for years. Gains that looked spectacular in a tiny test cell and evaporated the moment you tried to manufacture at any real volume. The team's solution was to stop treating the lattice relaxation effect and the interface coating as two separate fixes and instead design the electrode around both simultaneously, using the same machine learning framework that had identified the coating strategy in the first place. Think of it like a modern navigation app rerouting traffic in real time instead of just widening one road. The system does not fix a single bottleneck. It continuously identifies where lithium ions are struggling to enter the crystal and adjusts the interface engineering across the entire electrode surface to keep every available Euro-10 face working at once, rather than relying on a handful of favorably oriented particles to carry the whole load. Engineers who worked on this kind of materials discovery will tell you this detail rarely makes it into the public reporting. The electron microscopy and the machine learning model were not two separate stages of research. They ran in a continuous feedback loop, with each new imaging pass refining the model's prediction of where ion traffic was failing next. That loop is what allowed the coding strategy to scale from a single observed crystal to a full electrode design without losing the effect that made it work in the first place. The result was not a marginal improvement stacked on marginal improvements. It was a coordinated system, purpose-built around a mechanism nobody had been able to see clearly until this specific team looked. A number came out of that system that was fast enough and clean enough that the researchers did not publish it on the strength of a single test run. It went through peer review at one of the most rigorously checked journals in materials science before anyone was allowed to call it real. Here is the honest picture. The certified figure, published in Nature Communications and credited to researchers Yaqing Guo and Yifei Yuan, alongside collaborators across Chinese and American institutions, is this: 116 milliamp hours per gram, 68.5% of theoretical capacity, reached in 45 seconds at an 80C charging rate. You heard that, right? 45 seconds, peer-reviewed, not a press release, and this is the number that actually matters if you're trying to understand where this technology stands. Let me put that in terms that actually matter to a driver. A conventional EV fast charger, under good conditions, needs somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes to move a battery from a low charge to a usable one. A number like this, if it ever reaches a full production pack, points toward charging sessions measured in the time it takes to scan a parking ticket, not sit through a coffee break. And durability did not collapse to buy that speed. The modified material held 77% of its original capacity after 500 rapid charging cycles, a retention rate that would have been considered strong even for a battery charging 10 times slower. Here's the part that keeps this from being a finished product tomorrow morning, and it is the same part that explains where numbers like 6 seconds actually come from. Push a small format lab cell to even higher rates than 80C, and you can absolutely hit single-digit second charging, but only to a fraction of the cell's total capacity in a device built for a microscope stage, not a driveway. This result came from a half cell tested against a lithium metal counter electrode under controlled laboratory conditions. Niobium's cost and its concentrated global supply chain remain real obstacles between this discovery and a windshield sticker price. And scaling any laboratory electrode into a manufacturable one, at the volumes an auto industry actually needs, has been the graveyard of more than one promising battery chemistry. None of that changes what was actually proven. The fundamental physical wall that kept sub-1 minute charging out of reach for 7 years, the directional bottleneck nobody could see, has been identified, explained, and engineered around, on the record in a peer-reviewed journal. That is not a faster battery. That is proof the ceiling was never permanent in the first place. If a 45-second charging result surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you are there when we cover it. From here, the question stops being about one crystal in one lab. It becomes a question about what happens when this kind of thinking reaches an entire industry. The part nobody covers is what a result like this actually does to an industry, once the peer review is finished and the number is real. Range anxiety and charging time remain, according to the International Energy Agency, among the most consistently cited barriers to electric vehicle adoption worldwide, ahead of price, ahead of range itself, in many consumer surveys across markets. That means a genuine fix for sub-1 minute charging does not just improve one product line. It reaches EV manufacturing, consumer electronics, and eventually grid-scale storage. Anywhere a battery's charging speed is the thing standing between a technology and mainstream use. Adoption, though, requires far more than a promising paper. It requires a supply chain willing to source niobium at automotive volumes, a manufacturing process that can apply directional interface coatings across billions of particles without losing the effect that made the lab result work, and years of safety and durability testing beyond the 500 cycles already logged. None of that is fast, even when the underlying chemistry is. Here is a historical parallel worth remembering. Grid-scale lithium battery storage was written off as prohibitively expensive through most of the 2000s. Then, over roughly 1 decade, battery pack costs fell by close to 90%, according to widely cited industry cost-tracking data, and grid storage went from a fringe experiment to a mainstream utility investment. The pattern repeats across battery history. A mechanism gets discovered, gets dismissed as commercially irrelevant, and then quietly becomes the new baseline once manufacturing catches up to the chemistry. The genuine technical advantage in this discovery is not the niobium tungsten oxide crystal itself. That has been public peer-reviewed knowledge since 2018. The advantage is the machine learning guided interface engineering method used to find and correct the directional bottleneck, a process that took a dedicated research team years of iterative electron microscopy to develop. That kind of mechanistic understanding is far harder to replicate than a chemical formula sitting in a patent filing. Anyone can read a composition. Almost nobody can reproduce the years of imaging and modeling required to know exactly where and how to intervene. The ceiling that held sub-1 minute charging out of reach for 7 years was never a matter of politics, borders, or which lab got there first. It was a specific, identifiable transport bottleneck inside a crystal. And once someone actually saw it clearly, it stopped being a ceiling at all. And if directional bottlenecks inside a single battery material can hold an entire industry back for 7 years, it is worth asking what happens when that same philosophy gets applied to a full production battery already sitting inside real cars. I already covered a battery doing exactly that, a 9-minute full charge from a production pack already on the road. And the engineering behind it is just as counterintuitive as everything you just heard. Here is the largest thing this story actually proves, and it has nothing to do with any single crystal. For 7 years, an entire industry treated a physical limitation as permanent, simply because nobody had the tools to see what was actually happening at the atomic scale. That is the real story underneath both numbers you have heard about this material. Not that a battery got faster, but that a limit everyone assumed was fixed turned out to be a gap in observation, not a law of physics. If you made it this far, you now understand more about how fast-charging battery materials actually work than most people who write headlines about them for a living, including the difference between a real, peer-reviewed 45-second result and a technically true but misleading 6-second one. What was actually proven here is specific and real: the directional bottleneck limiting niobium. Tungsten oxide at extreme charging rates has been identified, explained through rate-dependent lattice relaxation, and engineered around using a machine learning-guided interface coating, all confirmed through peer review, not marketing. If this changed how you think about what impossible means in battery engineering, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the industry should keep chasing exotic materials like niobium tungsten oxide, even with a difficult supply chain? Or should it focus entirely on scaling chemistries that are already cheap and proven, even if they charge slower? Take a side. I have a feeling this comment section's gonna split right down the middle. I read every single one. See you in the next one.